In this section, we're going to investigate aspects of the rule of Henry VII and developments that occurred in England during that time period. We're going to aim to focus on three areas: the creation of political stability, Henry VII's foreign policy, and developments within the economy and the church. Although we're going to focus mostly on the reign of Henry VII, it's important to check out what went on around him, such as the reigns of the Yorkist kings, Edward IV, Richard III, and the early part of Henry VIII's reign. Before we start to examine the government of Henry VII, let's get a summary of how Henry VII came to be king. Henry VII came to the throne as part of the Wars of the Roses, a struggle between the families of York and Lancaster as to who had the right to the English throne. Henry was a distant relative of the Lancastrian family who, after the death of Edward, Prince of Wales, the son of Henry IV, at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, found himself in the unexpected position of the Lancastrian heir to the throne. His claim was rather weak. Henry Tudor's claim came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who was a descendant from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, who married his mistress, Catherine Swynford, and by this their children became legitimised. Both the Yorkists and the Lancastrians were descendants from the children of Edward III. Edward IV had done much to restore harmony to England. He was a strong and respected monarch, but his early death at the age of 41 reopened disputes over the crown. His brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was meant to act as regent until Edward's son, Edward V, came of age. However, he seized the throne for himself. His actions, and particularly the rumours that he had ordered the murder of the two princes in the Tower, made Richard a very unpopular king, and despite there being positive aspects to his rule, opposing groups began to once again entertain thoughts of rebellion. The Buckingham Revolt in 1483 demonstrated not only the strength of feeling against Richard, but also his ability to squash revolts. Since 1471, Henry had been in exile in Brittany. His support for Buckingham led Richard to put pressure on the Duke of Brittany to hand Henry over. As a result, Henry fled to France, where he had gained the support of the King of France, Charles VIII, to support an attempt to take the throne from Richard. Upon landing in Wales on the 7th of August 1485, Henry was able to march unopposed through Wales to meet Richard just outside Market Bosworth. On the 22nd of August 1485, the two armies fought the Battle of Bosworth Field and, through the support of the Stanleys, Henry was victorious. Although he didn't know it at the time, this began one of the most famous dynasties in English history.
Thanks, Zara. We're now going to talk about the creation of political stability. Henry VII had come to the throne at an unsettled time. If he was to protect his throne from usurpers and establish a dynasty, he needed to create stability. Remember, he was a usurper himself. This was achieved through both domestic measures and foreign policy. To start with, we're going to focus on what Henry did at home. Look at the next section for his actions in foreign policy. We're going to consider this question. Write the question down so you can refer back to it. This is essentially a descriptive question, and yes, I know you're probably always being told that description on its own isn't good. Well, you'd be right, but a really good answer to this question would do something called developed explanation. This means that you wouldn't just describe Henry's policies on their own, you'd also show how they achieved political stability to ensure your answer was directly linked to the question. This kind of writing probably wouldn't be a longer essay-style question where you need to show high levels of analysis. An exam-style question would probably ask you to explain one aspect, for example. Henry's immediate actions were designed to confirm his status as the rightful king, and not simply as a usurper of the throne. He was crowned king in October 1485. The ceremony gave Henry formal acknowledgement that he was the rightful monarch. Henry then summoned Parliament in November. As the king was the only person able to summon Parliament, its meeting was confirmation of Henry's status. Once sitting, Parliament also formally recognised Henry as king. This was important to his reign's stability, as Parliament was meant to represent the views of the country. Parliament also predated Henry's reign to August 21st, a day before the Battle of Bosworth, so that Henry was able to treat Richard's supporters as traitors. Henry's treatment of Richard's supporters also helped to prevent attempts to take his throne. He resorted to a balanced approach, such as with the Earl of Northumberland. Too harsh, and he may have encouraged people to turn against him. Henry rewarded his own supporters to ensure continued loyalty. In April 1486, Henry went on royal progress to confirm his status with his subjects. All these actions were designed to ensure there was no immediate attempt to take the throne from Henry. If Henry was to be certain of continued stability, he'd need to settle the disputes between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. He married Elizabeth of York in January 1486, and his first son and heir was born in September 1486. The fact that Henry's marriage came after his coronation meant the Yorkists were not able to have an equal claim to the throne, and the swiftness with which the marriage produced an heir gave permanence to the dynasty. To be absolutely sure, Henry also imprisoned the Earl of Warwick in the Tower in an attempt to keep rebellions being centred on him. Warwick was a Yorkist with a better claim to the throne than Henry. So, which parts of the answers were just facts and which parts were developed explanations? Here are the facts. Henry was crowned king and called Parliament. You could have left it at that, but you'd have only got a low mark. To reach the top levels, you need to develop your statements. So the next bits are developed explanation, as they are explaining why these facts are important to achieving stability. If you've done all the hard work in learning the facts and in using them in your answer, you might as well show the examiner why they're so important in helping you answer the question. Let's have another go at developed explanation by looking at the nobility. The nobility had grown in power over the 15th century to become overmighty subjects. They held great power in their local areas, and the practice of retaining meant they could use their armies against the monarch. To achieve political stability, Henry would therefore need to address the power of the nobility. He did this through a combination of rewards and punishments. Let's look at rewards first. Henry used patronage as a reward for loyalty. This helped to achieve stability, as the route to greater power lay with Henry and not in the local area. Again, the most loyal servants were given positions on the king's council. This was where the real power lay, as it was from these trusted men that Henry took advice. Therefore, the way to greater power and influence once again lay with loyalty to Henry. Henry also used the Order of the Garter as a reward for loyal service. This prestigious honour was dependent on loyalty to Henry. It also did not come with land. This was significant as it did not provide the recipient with a power base away from Henry and kept Henry as the foremost landowner in the country. For those that didn't demonstrate loyalty, there were punishments. Acts of attainder were used to strip the family of land. This meant that they lost their power base and also the financial benefits of their land, which reverted back to the king. Acts of attainder could be reversed, and this also helped Henry as it encouraged the punished noble to demonstrate loyalty to Henry, and Henry often attached conditions upon reversal. Bonds and recognizances kept the nobility in check by acting as a guarantee of good behaviour and raising the finances of the king at the expense of the nobility. Henry's use of feudal dues was extensive. He employed lawyers to ensure these were exploited to the full. This was mainly to increase Henry's treasury, but it also asserted his position over the nobility, as they were forced to acknowledge his rights over areas of their lives, such as marriage. There was still the problem of retaining, which could pose a serious threat to the stability of Henry's throne. He passed acts limiting the numbers of indentured servants a noble was allowed to have, and they required a licence to retain. Henry couldn't abolish retaining altogether, as England had no standing army. So in times of war and threats to national security, these private armies would be called into use. Aspects that you would also need to examine are central government, parliament, finance, localities. Certainly, it would be fair to say that Henry did pass on a stable throne to his son. But was it at a cost to his popularity? As a historian, it's your job to carry out investigations using evidence. However, you shouldn't just take sources of evidence at face value. You need to evaluate them and ask yourself, how useful is this source for my investigation? Your examiner will want to find out how you use evidence, so you're quite likely to meet questions like this one. How useful is this source as evidence about Henry VII's popularity as king? This day is the end of our slavery, the fount of our liberty, the end of sadness, the beginning of joy. Sir Thomas More, 1509, on the accession of Henry VIII. Well, I would say this source is very useful because it tells me that Henry VII was very unpopular. Well, that's an accurate answer, but it's not going to get me very many marks. So I think I'll use some evidence from the source to develop and support my statement. The fact that Sir Thomas More claimed that the accession of Henry VIII would bring joy and end sadness suggests he was unhappy with the rule of Henry VII. He also compared life under Henry VII to slavery, once again suggesting that Henry VII's methods were restrictive and controlling and unpopular. That's it, isn't it? Well, I hope you're shouting at the TV telling me it isn't. I've still only answered half the question because I've shown no assessment of the source as evidence. So how do I assess the source? By asking questions about it. I need to know more than the content. I need to be able to use my knowledge and place it in context. I also need to look at ways in which the source helps me to understand Henry's popularity as a king, and also look at ways in which the source is not useful. I need to ask, what type of source is it? Who produced it? When was it produced? For what purpose was the source produced? Once you've asked these questions, you'll be placed in a much better position to fully answer the question. So let's finish off. The source was produced by Sir Thomas More in 1509 in praise of the accession of Henry VIII. He was a supporter of Henry VIII and would become prominent in Henry VIII's early government. Under Henry VII, he was a member of the House of Parliament, and in 1504 spoke out against Henry's request for a grant. He was fined and placed in the Tower of London for his troubles. This would suggest that he is likely to be biased against Henry VII and would be unlikely to paint him in a favourable light. So we'd need to be careful in assuming this was the opinion of everyone towards Henry VII. Moreover, the timing of the source is significant. It is not whilst Henry VII was alive, nor is it in reference to him, but in reference to Henry VIII's coronation. It's likely that the purpose of the piece is to demonstrate loyalty and support to the new king, and therefore the strength of opinion against Henry VII may have been exaggerated. However, the source is a contemporary source, and as such is useful in reflecting some of the opinions of Henry VII at the time. The fact that it's after Henry VII has died may reflect truer feelings than More could say whilst the king was alive. With knowledge, it is a reflection of many of the nobility's feelings towards Henry, following the severity with which he controlled them. A good supporting example of this is the arrest and execution of Empson and Dudley and the abolition of the council learned in the law so early in Henry VIII's reign. In this way, I've used my knowledge to place the source in context, and I've shown ways in which the source is useful and ways in which it could cause me problems. As As we mentioned earlier, one of the key factors in Henry's foreign policy was the desire for security, both to secure the throne from immediate threats and to secure the Tudor dynasty. However, people are rarely motivated by a single factor, and two other key factors can be seen in his foreign policy aims. Firstly, the desire to increase the prestige of England in Europe, and secondly, to promote English trade. Often, you'll need to assess the relative importance of factors within an answer. So let's have a look at key events and relationships within Henry's foreign policy to assess the relative importance of security, prestige, or trade as a factor in driving foreign policy. What's important here is that we're not going to give a narrative of Henry's foreign policy. We're going to start to evaluate it, and it's the evaluation bit that gets you to the top levels. Clearly, there's not enough time here to look at all the finer details of Henry's dealings with foreign powers, so we're going to have a look at the main features. You'll find more on trade in the final section. Henry's first international crisis came with the Brittany crisis in 1487. The reasons for his involvement can give us a clue as to the key factors behind foreign policy. If the French controlled Brittany, it would increase the power of France and provide a launch pad for an invasion of England and could potentially disrupt England's trade ships. Henry had also spent many years in exile in Brittany, and he could now repay the generosity of the Duke of Brittany with his support. Other European countries were concerned about the French attack. This led to one of the most significant treaties of Henry's reign, the Treaty of Medina del Campo in 1489, which cemented Henry's ties with Spain. An alliance with such a major European power gave prestige to Henry's rule and provided security against France. In addition, it provided security for the Tudor dynasty, with an agreement of marriage between Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon. Henry also agreed that England and Spain would launch a joint attack on France to recover the lost territories of Normandy and Aquitaine. Spain looked to recover territory in the Pyrenees. The treaty also contained favourable trading terms. Unfortunately for Henry, the promise of support from Spain and Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, had never materialised, and he had faced rebellion at home when subsidies were requested to fund the war. He was also facing the additional threat of Perkin Warbeck, who had arrived in France in 1492. If Henry withdrew now, he would lose prestige, but in reality he was unable to sustain a long war on his own. So, Henry signed the Treaty of Étaples with France. This allowed Henry to maintain prestige as he was given French compensation for removing his troops. The treaty also contained a promise not to harbour rebels, therefore closing the door for Perkin Warbeck and other Yorkist rebels. The treaty also included a reduction of trade restrictions between England and France. However, Brittany had been lost to France, and it seems here that the arrival of Perkin Warbeck was the final factor in Henry choosing to make peace with France, achieving greater security for his throne. Until his capture in 1497, the problem of Perkin Warbeck continued to influence Henry's foreign policy. When Warbeck arrived in Burgundy in 1492, Henry followed with a trade embargo on the use of Antwerp by English merchants. They had to use Calais instead. Whilst this hurt Antwerp more than it did English merchants, it can be used as an example of Henry placing security of the throne as the highest priority. Once Warbeck had gone from Burgundy, Henry signed the Magnus Intercursus with Philip of Burgundy. This was, in the most part, a trade treaty and allowed English merchants to trade freely in all parts except Flanders. Disagreements with Burgundy continued both in trade and when the Yorkist claimant Edmund de la Pole fled to Maximilian in 1501. Philip of Burgundy, Maximilian's son, used this to impose trade restrictions on England and in 1505 Henry stopped trade between England and Burgundy. This is another example of security over trade as the priority. The intercursus malus imposed on Philip in 1506 was so unrealistically harsh that it can also be seen as Henry not placing trade as his priority. With Scotland too, issues of security were at the forefront of Henry's aims. He needed to secure the northern borders, and when Perkin Warbeck was received there in 1495, this became a pressing issue. After an unsuccessful invasion attempt by Warbeck and a few Scottish nobles, the Truce of Ayton was signed to end hostility between England and Scotland. This was furthered in the Treaty of Perpetual Peace in 1502 and marriage of Henry's daughter Margaret to James IV in 1503. Henry's actions in the Castilian succession crisis demonstrate his desire to develop English prestige abroad. His indecision as to who to support, Philip or Ferdinand, demonstrates that he was unwilling to maintain his relationship with Spain if its power was significantly reduced. Henry's final decision to ally with Philip was, however, a matter of security and trade. Edmund de la Pole was being harboured by Burgundy, and Antwerp was a key link in English trade, when Philip unexpectedly arrived in England after being blown off course on his way to Spain. Henry allied with Philip. Making a judgment is always a positive move and demonstrates that you are able to analyse the evidence. Within your conclusion, it's a good idea to really show the examiner your opinion. Sum up your points and demonstrate any links between them. From the evidence that we have here, it seems that issues of security were at the forefront of Henry's foreign policy, such as Henry's need to secure his northern borders from a Scottish attack. However, issues of trade and prestige were also important considerations. In almost all of the major treaties, trade clauses were included. However, it was external circumstances that drove the treaties in the first place. Even the Intercursus Magnus was only instigated once Perkin Warbeck had left Burgundy. Considerations of prestige also linked to security, because a throne that has international status and prestige is also more difficult to challenge. Therefore, Henry's ties to Spain brought security from a possible French attack, and prestige to be linked to such a powerful country. Loads of treaties and events in this section. As part of your revision, try producing a timeline so that you can see how they relate to each other.
Within this section, we're going to be looking at the church, enclosure, and the development of trade routes. We'll start by looking at questions that test your understanding of a key term linked to your course. Now, these tend to be low-mark questions, so don't be tempted to write too much. You'll need this valuable thinking time when it comes to the evaluation questions later on in the paper. To help you to remember this, questions will often be worded with phrases such as briefly explain or comment on. For example, comment on the meaning of absenteeism in the context of the church in the late 15th century. Now, absenteeism refers to the absence of a priest or bishop from his parish or diocese. Well, I know I said briefly, but a little bit more is needed to develop this statement and address the final part of the question in the context of the church in the late 15th century. Now, absenteeism had been a common feature of medieval church for a long time. This usually came as a result of pluralism and the practice of the monarch who used positions in the church as a form of patronage. Many of the king's most trusted councillors would also hold bishoprics. However, their duties meant that they would be unable to fulfil the obligations of their church positions. For example, Richard Fox was both keeper of the Privy Seal and held several bishoprics. Other church priests had administrative duties to carry out for the church, and were given a parish from which they could draw an income from, but did not carry out any spiritual role. This didn't mean that the congregation were left unministered. They employed lower clergy for those functions. I could be tempted to wander into discussions about the structure of the church and attitudes towards absenteeism, but this is really not necessary for the low level of marks allocated to such a question. A mid-range question may ask you to consider a variety of factors, such as causation. As soon as you read why, you know that you must identify reasons and not give a blow-by-blow account of what happened, or provide a detailed description of a feature of the period. Look at this question. We've already looked at absenteeism and its links to pluralism, but we do need to explain why it caused the church to become unpopular. For example, Dean John Cabot in 1511, speaking to the Convocation, claimed that the clergy had become too ambitious and had lost their morals. He also attacked the quality of all levels of priest. Parishioners were also paying the tithe to a minister who never attended their spiritual needs. The Hun case also highlights the resistance of some to paying dues to the priest, though this kind of case was in the minority. Another criticism of those at the top of the church was the charge of simony. Though difficult to prove how wide its use really was, it can be used as further evidence of ambition over morals. At the lower levels, parish clergy were criticised for not being well educated and not fulfilling the duties of their position effectively. Criticisms also spread to monastic orders, where some were seen as corrupt and too concerned with worldly matters. Henry VII was concerned that the orders should be restored and petitioned the Pope for help in 1487. Criticisms of the clergy were not just centred on their ability to carry out their religious duties, but also upon the benefit of clergy. Okay, let's look at this in a bit more depth. Okay. An Act of 1489 passed by Henry VII shows that this was of concern. This act limited the granting of benefit of clergy to only those genuinely within holy orders after the first offence. There were some who abused the system by invoking their right to benefit of clergy, who in reality had little to do with the church. This was as a result of the fact that the church courts often gave much lighter punishments than the king's courts, even for offences such as murder. The Hun case is a good example of the criticism this kind of practice invoked. There were groups who attacked the abuses of the church. People such as John Cabot represented the views of the humanists who believed in reforming the church. They did not directly challenge its doctrine or the authority of the Pope, though they did press us for a simpler church based more on personal worship and the Bible. The group that really challenged the existing church during this period were the Lollards. They believed that the Bible was at the centre of religious belief and that it should be available to everyone in their own language. They challenged the authority of the Pope, believing the monarch should be in charge, and rejected the doctrine of transubstantiation. This amounted to heresy, and any evidence found of Lollard activity, including possession of banned books, resulted in being burnt at the stake for heresy. Be careful, though, of assuming that criticisms of the church were widespread. For example, the Lollards were only really active in areas surrounding London. It's okay to contradict the assumption of the question, so long as you support your views with evidence. The fact that you are able to do so demonstrates that you have a really good understanding of the key issues surrounding the question. So, what evidence is there, apart from the small scale of the Lollards, to suggest that people were still supportive of the church? Well, we know that money was still continued to be spent on church, and also be left by ordinary people in their wills. This all shows that they were still supportive of the church. We know that priests were still very conservative in their views because of the counts of the types of books they read. Visitations to monastic orders were on the whole positive in their findings. A good conclusion should sum up all the points you have made, including your argument. In a why question, try to identify a key reason. Now, we've already begun to talk about trade in the section on foreign policy. So in looking at the economy, we'll examine two issues through another starter question and a why question. Explain briefly the meaning of enclosure in the context of the economy of the late 15th century. So, what are the key words in this question? Enclosure is the key word to describe. Briefly warns me not to go into too much depth, and to get top marks, I need to remember to place my answer into the context of the economy of the late 15th century. Enclosure refers to the fencing off of areas of common land for private use by wealthy landowners. It was also used to describe the practice of joining individual holdings to become one large area farmed by a single person. Well, that provides the key term, but it also needs placing in context. This practice was becoming increasingly common in the late 15th century due to the growth of the cloth trade. Now, this growth increased the demand for wool, making sheep farming a more profitable option than traditional arable farming. Enclosure also meant that farmers were able to try new techniques in farming without being held back by the community. The impact of enclosure on many villages, particularly the poorest, was a movement away from traditional farming towards developing industries such as the metal industry and towards life in a town. As we have just seen, the growth of trade was a major factor in accelerating the process of enclosure. Whilst Henry VII was concerned about the negative effects of enclosure, he was also keen to see the expansion of overseas trade. In foreign policy, we looked at analysing how important trade was in foreign policy. So in this section, we'll have a look at a why question. Right then. Why was Henry VII so keen to develop overseas trades? Now, before we go into this answer, it's really important to remember that when you're revising, you shouldn't just learn the facts, as you won't know how to apply them in an exam. So I think it's a really good idea to consider key questions. You certainly don't have to write full answers, but perhaps it would be useful to make use of a quick reference mind map. As we talk through the answer, look at how my mind map uses key words from which my thoughts can develop. Customs duties were part of the monarch's prerogative rights and were more granted to the king traditionally on his accession by Parliament. Money gained from these was used predominantly to build up defence, which aided national security. Clearly then it was to Henry's advantage to increase the amount of money gained through customs duties by encouraging a growth in trade. A strong and developing economy also meant greater security at home. If people were satisfied with their economic position, it would be less likely that they would rebel. Henry looked for ways of supporting and developing trade. For example, the Magnus intercursus with Burgundy and his support for the Merchant Adventurers Company in London. In his dealings with the Hanseatic League, Henry was keen to reduce its influence for the benefit of English traders. Now, supporting and developing English shipping would also ensure greater national security with the development of the Navy. The Navigation Acts of 1485 and 1489 helped the development of English ships. The creation of a dry dock in Portsmouth shows further Henry's commitment to developing the Navy. Henry was also keen to support overseas expansion at a time when countries, such as Spain and Portugal, were also funding voyages of discovery. He patronised the voyages of John Cabot to search for a route to the east by sailing west. This would avoid the need to travel via the Mediterranean, an issue which had brought Henry into conflict with Venice. Overseas expansion and the development of trade added to English prestige abroad. The Treaty of Medina de Campo with Spain, for example, contained advantageous trading terms. Furthermore, the growing importance of English cloth gave Henry a bargaining tool in trade disputes with Venice and trading rights with France. Nearly there now. Well done for staying the course.